Akutan Island, Alaska. July 10th, 1942. The fog hung low over the Aleutian Islands, a gray silence stretching across the sea. Below the clouds, a U.S. Navy search plane drifted through the mist, its engines humming over desolate hills of tundra and wind. Then one of the crewmen saw it, a glint of metal in the marshland below. They circled once, then twice. There, nose buried in the soft mud, lay a Japanese Zero. Perfect, intact, its wings unbroken. For months, that aircraft had ruled the skies of the Pacific, untouchable, unstoppable. It had shredded Allied squadrons over the Philippines, Java, and the Coral Sea. No pilot had seen one up close and lived. Now, by pure accident, the enemy's secret weapon lay silent and waiting, preserved by the same wet earth that had killed its pilot. When recovery crews finally reached it days later, they realized what they had found: a treasure worth more than gold. The captured Zero would soon be flown, tested, and dissected, and the knowledge it revealed would help turn the tide of the entire Pacific War. The myth of Japanese air superiority had just begun to crack. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific skies belonged entirely to Japan. Everywhere the Zero flew, it conquered, from the jungles of Malaya to the clouds above the Coral Sea. Allied pilots faced the same nightmare: a ghostly silver plane that appeared out of nowhere, struck with lightning speed, and vanished into the sun. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, as it was officially named, was more than an airplane. It was the embodiment of Japan's military philosophy: speed, precision, and sacrifice fused into one machine. Weighing barely 2 tons, powered by a radial engine that screamed like a banshee, the Zero could climb faster and turn tighter than anything the Americans or British could send against it. It outmaneuvered the P-40 Warhawk, outclimbed the Brewster Buffalo, and outpaced the Wildcat, the U.S. Navy's front-line fighter. The result was catastrophe. In the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, the Japanese destroyed or crippled Allied air power across the Pacific. In Burma, British squadrons were wiped out. Over the Philippines, the U.S. Army Air Corps was mauled. And above the Coral Sea, the Zero's dominance forced the Allies to fight blind, their aircraft outclassed at every turn. The Zero had achieved what no one thought possible: complete air superiority over one of the largest theaters of war on Earth. To Allied pilots, the Zero was a riddle they could not solve. They could see it, but they couldn't touch it. The aircraft seemed almost supernatural, capable of impossible turns and climbs that defied aerodynamics. The few pilots who managed to shoot one down rarely lived to tell how they did it. Those who survived spoke of an enemy that could turn inside their own aircraft in seconds, of duels where every defensive move led to death. In the spring of 1942, American intelligence still knew almost nothing about the Zero. Its top speed, range, and construction were all guesswork. The Allies didn't even know its true name. Most reports referred to it as the Zeke, or simply, the new Japanese fighter. Desperate engineers studied gun camera footage, fragments from wrecks, and even pilot testimonies. None of it was enough. The mystery deepened, and with it, the fear. At every airfield and briefing room across the Pacific, one phrase spread among American pilots: "If you see a Zero, run." By early summer 1942, The United States was fighting a war it barely understood. Naval battles like Coral Sea and Midway had proven that courage could slow the Japanese advance. But they also revealed something far more troubling. Even when outnumbered, Japan's pilots and planes still seemed to dominate one-on-one combat. The Americans needed more than bravery. They needed understanding. What made the Zero so light? Why could it turn so tightly? And most importantly, how could it be beaten? But the odds of finding those answers were almost impossible. Every Zero shot down either exploded or sank into the ocean. The few wrecks recovered were little more than twisted scrap. To dissect one, to truly know it, would take a miracle. Then, in June 1942, that miracle appeared from the fog of the Aleutian Islands. While the Battle of Midway raged far to the south, a smaller, colder war was being fought in the Alaskan chain. Japan had launched air raids from the captured islands of Attu and Kiska, a diversion meant to pull American attention away from the Central Pacific, among the Japanese planes flying. Those missions was a Zero from the carrier Ryujo, piloted by Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga. During one sortie over Dutch Harbor, his plane was hit by ground fire. The engine sputtered. Fuel streamed from the wings. With his two wingmen watching, Koga tried to reach Kiska, but his fuel was gone. Through the fog, he spotted what looked like flat ground on Akutan Island and prepared for an emergency landing. He never saw the hidden bog beneath the grass. The Zero flipped on impact, killing Koga instantly. But the soft mud cushioned the wreckage, preserving every bolt, panel, and instrument. When American patrols stumbled upon it weeks later, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The enemy's most secret weapon, undamaged, unburned, untouched. A single crash had just handed the Allies the key to the Pacific sky. From that moment, the war in the air would never be the same again. Because buried in that Alaskan mud was more than a machine. It was a roadmap to victory, waiting to be read. The recovery team arrived days later, trekking through rain and fog over the windswept ridges of Akutan Island. They expected wreckage, twisted metal, perhaps an engine or a shattered wing. Instead, they found perfection. The Zero lay belly up, its pale green paint barely scuffed. The propeller blades were bent, the landing gear torn off, but the fuselage was almost untouched. The cockpit glass was cracked, but clear. Inside, the pilot's body was still strapped to the seat, a reminder of how close the machine had come to surviving the war that claimed him. The men worked in silence. They buried Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga nearby with full military honors, then turned their attention to the prize. In the biting wind, they began disassembling the plane piece by piece. Every panel was catalogued. Every instrument was photographed. When fog lifted, Navy float planes swooped in, carrying the components to Dutch Harbor, and from there aboard ship to San Diego. By late August 1942, the Akutan Zero had arrived at North Island Naval Air Station, under heavy guard and complete secrecy. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Allies had an intact specimen of Japan's most feared weapon. The Navy assigned its most experienced test pilot, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, to the project. His orders were simple but daunting: fly the enemy plane, measure everything, and find its weaknesses. When Sanders climbed into the cockpit that September, the hangar fell silent. Mechanics, engineers, and officers gathered outside to watch history take flight. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. The Zero lifted easily from the runway. In the air, it performed just as its legend described. Light, agile, almost alive. It could outturn anything the Americans had. Sanders wrote in his flight log, "Its maneuverability is fantastic. It handles like a feather." But within hours, the myth began to unravel. The Zero's greatest strength, its lightness, was also its greatest flaw. It lacked armor. Its fuel tanks were unprotected. Its control surfaces stiffened badly above 250 knots, making high-speed dives nearly impossible. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was unmatched. But in the reality of prolonged combat, it was fragile, a blade that broke on impact. Sanders' team documented every limitation. The Zero could not roll quickly at high speed. It stalled violently in tight turns. It couldn't sustain damage. And most importantly, it could be outclimbed and outdived by heavier American fighters if they avoided turning engagements. The mystery that had haunted Allied pilots for a year had just been solved in a single flight. The data spread through the Navy like wildfire, though under strict secrecy. A new tactical manual, Fighting the Zero, was drafted and distributed to combat squadrons across the Pacific. Its advice was direct and revolutionary. Never dogfight a Zero. Use altitude, speed, and vertical maneuvers. Attack from above, then dive away. The document transformed Allied air combat overnight. Where once pilots had panicked and tried to outturn their opponents, now they fought with discipline and confidence. Every weakness the Akutan tests revealed became a weapon in itself. For the first time, the balance in the Pacific began to tilt. At the same time, the engineers at Grumman Aircraft on Long Island studied the Akutan data with obsessive focus. They had already been designing a successor to the F4F Wildcat, a heavier, faster fighter intended to challenge Japan's dominance. Now, with the Zero's true nature exposed, they knew exactly what to build. The result would be the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a machine born not from guesswork, but from intelligence. The Hellcat would be everything the Zero was not: armored, powerful, forgiving in combat, and deadly at any altitude. It would not just fight the Zero. It would destroy the legend of the Zero. And as 1943 dawned, that transformation was nearly complete. From the cold mud of Akutan to the laboratories of California, the war in the air had shifted from fear to understanding, from reaction to dominance. The hunter was about to become the hunted. When Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders first saw the Akutan Zero in the San Diego hangar, he circled it like a predator studying prey. Its smooth lines and long wingspan seemed almost alien, elegant, dangerous, unlike anything built in America. Yet beneath the grace, he saw fragility. He knew what was being asked of him. To fly this plane wasn't an experiment. It was a gamble. No one knew how the controls would respond, how the engine would react, or if the plane would even stay together at speed. But Sanders volunteered anyway. He had flown everything in the Navy's arsenal. Yet this was different. This was the enemy's heart, laid bare. When the engine first coughed to life, the sound echoed across the airfield. A Japanese tone in an American sky. Ground crews stepped back, uneasy. The moment the wheels lifted off, history changed course. For weeks, Sanders flew the Zero again and again. He pushed it to its limits, recording every vibration, every hesitation, every strength. He pulled more than 30 test flights, sometimes landing with smoke trailing from the engine. He later wrote in his notebook, "It feels like a kite in the wind, graceful but fragile. If I sneeze, it might break." The courage of that single test pilot, risking his life not in battle but in knowledge, turned the course of a war. His flights gave American engineers the insight that thousands of combat missions could not. Through skill, instinct, and a willingness to face the unknown, Eddie Sanders became the quiet bridge between defeat and dominance. The engineers who worked on the Akutan Zero treated it like an alien artifact. Every component was measured, every rivet examined. When they peeled away its panels, what they found shocked them. The Zero's incredible agility didn't come from superior power. It came from sacrifice. It was built without armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no protective steel around the cockpit. Even its aluminum skin was thinner than expected, so thin that a mechanic could dent it with a thumb. Japan had traded survivability for speed. It was a fighter designed for offense, not endurance. American engineers noted that this design worked perfectly for early war Japan, where pilots were elite, trained to perfection, and conditioned to die rather than retreat. But it was unsustainable. Every loss was irreplaceable. Every pilot killed was one fewer master in the sky. The U.S., by contrast, could build machines and train men by the thousands. They didn't need perfection. They needed consistency. And that was where technology triumphed over philosophy. The captured Zero gave engineers at Grumman exactly what they needed: a checklist of what not to do. The Hellcat was born from that contrast. Where the Zero's wings were delicate, the Hellcats were reinforced. Where the Zero burned easily, the Hellcat could take hits and still fly home. Where the Zero strained at high speeds, the Hellcat thrived in dives and climbs. It was as if the Americans had read the Zero's diary and rewritten every line in steel. The Zero's arrival had once forced American pilots to fight blind. Its agility made dogfighting suicidal. Its range allowed it to strike far beyond what seemed possible. But the Akutan tests changed all that. Armed with Sanders' reports, the Navy rewrote its air combat manual. The new rule was simple: don't fight the Zero on its terms. American pilots were taught to use their speed and weight to advantage. Dive, fire, and climb. Attack from altitude, then break away. Never turn with the enemy. Strike, disengage, and strike again. This approach, known as boom and zoom, became the foundation of U.S. air tactics in the Pacific. It turned the Zero's agility into a weakness. By refusing to dogfight, American pilots denied Japanese flyers their only advantage. In mock battles between the captured Zero and new U.S. fighters, the results were decisive. Once the Hellcat and Corsair entered service, the tables turned permanently. By 1943, the U.S. Navy no longer feared the Zero. They studied it, predicted it, and destroyed it with cold efficiency. The once invincible plane of Pearl Harbor was now a predictable target. Every maneuver the Zero made, every turn, every roll, the Americans already knew it by heart. The tactical revolution was complete. Knowledge had replaced fear. The courage of one test pilot, the brilliance of a few engineers, and the adaptability of an entire military had transformed panic into dominance. And as 1943 moved into 1944, those lessons would take physical form in the Hellcat, the machine designed to end the myth of the Zero once and for all. When the first reports from the Akutan tests reached Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters at Pearl Harbor, the mood changed. For months, American commanders had been fighting a defensive war, improvising, retreating, and learning the hard way. But now they had data. Real, measurable, undeniable truth about their enemy's weapon. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics quickly distributed the test results under the highest classification. Nimitz, along with Admiral Ernest King and Rear Admiral Mark Mitscher, recognized what this meant. Air combat could finally be fought on their terms. In briefings, Nimitz reminded his officers that courage alone wouldn't win the Pacific. Intelligence would. The Akutan Zero had turned intelligence from theory into strategy. Orders flowed to Grumman Aircraft Engineering, whose founder Leroy Grumman took personal interest in the findings. His engineers pored over the test notes and aerodynamic profiles, adjusting the design of their new fighter, the F6F Hellcat, around the Zero's weaknesses. The result was not coincidence. It was design born from knowledge. The Hellcat's roll rate was engineered to counter the Zero's sluggish high-speed turns. Its armor plate was positioned to absorb 20mm cannon fire. Its rugged construction meant that even a damaged plane could make it back to the carrier deck. Nimitz later described the Hellcat as a fighter built by engineers who had studied the enemy firsthand. It was a perfect fusion of leadership, science, and purpose. Something the Japanese command structure, rigid and pride-bound, could never replicate. Where Japan relied on myth and discipline, America relied on adaptation and innovation. The balance of air power was about to shift forever. When word reached Japanese naval intelligence that one of their Zeros had failed to return from the Aleutian mission, they assumed it had been destroyed. No search parties were sent. The pilot, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, was quietly listed as missing. No one in Japan imagined that his plane was lying intact in enemy hands. For months, the Japanese believed their design secrets were safe. The Zero continued to dominate most battles through 1942, over the Solomons, over Rabaul, over New Guinea. But something subtle began to change. By mid-1943, American pilots were fighting differently. They no longer tried to turn with Japanese fighters. They attacked from above and vanished into the clouds. Dogfights that once ended in Japanese victory now ended in disaster. Reports filtered back to Tokyo. Zeros were being outflown, outshot, outclimbed. Entire formations were being shredded by heavier American aircraft that seemed to know every weakness of their beloved fighter. The reaction inside Japan's Navy Ministry was disbelief. Engineers insisted their aircraft was still superior. Commanders blamed inexperienced pilots, but those at the front lines, the veterans of China and the Coral Sea, knew the truth. The Americans had cracked the code. When the first F6F Hellcats appeared in 1943, the effect was devastating. Japanese pilots who had once mocked the clumsy Americans were now being shot down at ratios never before seen in modern warfare. One Japanese ace, Saburo Sakai, recalled later, "They knew our strengths, our turns, our habits. It was as if they had been flying Zeros themselves." He was right. They had. That realization marked the end of Japan's air supremacy, not because of inferiority in spirit, but because of failure to adapt. The Akutan Zero had turned from a symbol of pride into an unintentional gift, a gift that doomed its own creators. War is rarely shaped by mercy, but sometimes it is shaped by chance. When Petty Officer Koga crashed on Akutan Island, he likely believed his failure was a dishonor. In the Japanese code of Bushido, to lose one's aircraft and not return was a disgrace. Yet in death, he accomplished what no Japanese officer could have foreseen. He handed the Allies the knowledge that would save thousands of lives. The irony was profound. One man's misfortune, buried in the mud of a forgotten island, would alter the moral equation of the Pacific. For every American pilot who died in 1942 not understanding why he couldn't win, the Akutan Zero offered redemption. It turned blind sacrifice into informed strategy. It proved that science could outthink even the fiercest warrior. In a way, the story of the captured Zero reflected the deeper truth of the Second World War. That ideology and courage alone could not overcome innovation and analysis. After the war, when historians pieced together the events of Akutan, many noted the quiet dignity with which U.S. servicemen had buried Koga before recovering his aircraft. They honored him not as an enemy, but as a fellow airman who had unwittingly changed the world. Even decades later, American pilots who flew Hellcats would speak of that irony with respect. The war had turned his crash into victory, but they never forgot the man inside the cockpit. By 1943, the Hellcat was rolling off production lines, and the Pacific sky that once belonged to Japan was about to fall silent beneath its roar. What began with a single crash in the fog would soon culminate in one of the most lopsided air battles in history. By mid-1943, the Pacific War had shifted. The United States Navy, once reeling from defeat, now had a new weapon in its hangars, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. It didn't look glamorous. It wasn't sleek like the Zero. It was broad-shouldered, heavy, almost brutish in appearance. But behind that bulk was genius. Design born from knowledge. Strength born from experience. At Grumman's factory in Bethpage, Long Island, engineers had worked day and night, turning every page of the Akutan test reports into design decisions. The Zero could outturn anything? Then the Hellcat would not turn. It would dive faster, climb higher, and take punishment no Japanese aircraft could survive. It carried armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 650 caliber Browning machine guns, enough firepower to shred even the toughest enemy fighter. The Hellcat was built for one purpose: to hunt the Zero. The Hellcat's baptism came during the Wake Island raids in October 1943. As American carrier decks thundered with takeoffs, pilots knew this was the moment. The first real test of the new generation of fighters born from the captured Zero's secrets. In the skies above the Pacific, they met the enemy. The Japanese defenders climbed swiftly, confident as ever. For 2 years, they had fought and won on the strength of their aircraft's agility. But when the Hellcats came into range, the fight changed instantly. The U.S. pilots didn't turn with them. They dove, straight down at nearly 400 knots, then arced back up, blasting cannon fire into the enemy wings before rolling away. It was the new doctrine in motion. The Zero pilots, trained for close duels, couldn't follow. Their planes shuddered and lost lift in the dives. The Hellcats climbed out of reach, then came back down again, like hammer blows from the sky. By the end of the first day, U.S. Navy pilots had shot down 38 Japanese aircraft for the loss of just 6. Those numbers told a story louder than any propaganda. For the first time since 1941, the Zero had met its equal and lost. After Wake Island, the Hellcat became the standard-bearer of U.S. air power. It served aboard nearly every major carrier group: Essex, Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown, each carrying squadrons of the blue-painted beasts ready to take back the Pacific, island by island. From Tarawa to Kwajalein, from Truk Lagoon to Saipan, the Hellcat dominated. Japanese pilots quickly realized that the old tactics no longer worked. The Americans had learned their every move and countered it. In combat reports from 1944, one Japanese commander wrote, "Our pilots fight bravely, but the enemy's new planes are relentless. They climb faster, dive harder, and absorb damage we cannot inflict twice." The fear that had once haunted American squadrons was now reversed. When U.S. pilots spotted Zeros below, they no longer radioed warnings, they radioed opportunity. It was the defining air battle of the Pacific, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a clash of over 900 aircraft, fought above the vast blue between the Mariana Islands and the Philippine coast. The Japanese launched wave after wave of fighters and bombers, hoping to crush the American fleet and reclaim the initiative. But waiting for them at 20,000 feet were over 200 Hellcats. Radar-guided, disciplined, and equipped with superior altitude control, the American pilots executed their training perfectly. They didn't dogfight, they ambushed. The sky erupted in a storm of machine gun fire and falling metal. Japanese formations disintegrated before they even reached their targets. The once feared Zero was shredded mid-air, its light frame tearing apart under sustained bursts of .50 caliber fire. The engagement became so one-sided that American pilots began referring to it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, Japanese carrier aviation was annihilated. They lost over 300 aircraft and hundreds of their most experienced pilots. The U.S. lost just 29 planes. The kill ratio was almost beyond belief. 18 to 1. Exactly as history would record it. That day, the Pacific sky changed forever. For the first time, the Americans owned it, completely, irreversibly. Every lesson from the Akutan Zero had come full circle. The aircraft that once symbolized invincibility had now become the template for its own destruction. And the irony was almost poetic. The Hellcat, the plane born from the enemy's design, was now the hammer of retribution, flying with the calm confidence of a force that understood not just how to fight, but why it was winning. From that point on, Japan's air arm never recovered. The myth of the Zero had ended not in glory, but in the wreckage scattered across the Pacific. And in every cockpit of every Hellcat that day, the spirit of one lost plane from Akutan lived on, teaching, guiding, avenging. The Americans had turned intelligence into power, but the war wasn't over yet. Ahead lay the final test. The battles of Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where the Hellcat would meet the last desperate fury of Japan's air defenses. And once again, the lessons of the captured Zero would decide the outcome. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire was collapsing from within. Factories were silent, fuel reserves dwindled, and the elite corps of Zero pilots, the same men who had terrorized the Pacific in 1941, were gone. In their place stood barely trained cadets, some with fewer than 100 flight hours, sent to fight against an enemy that now ruled the skies. The U.S. Navy's Hellcats patrolled above every island, from the Philippines to Okinawa. They flew in formations that cast shadows across entire beaches, their engines humming like an unending storm. For the Japanese pilots below, the sky no longer offered freedom, only inevitability. Every mission felt like a sentence, and the sound of that sentence was unmistakable. The deep, confident roar of the Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, 2,000 horsepower of unstoppable precision. The Hunter had become the sky itself. In October 1944, the U.S. launched its return to the Philippines, an operation led by General Douglas MacArthur and supported by the full might of carrier aviation. When Japanese aircraft rose to meet them over Leyte Gulf, the outcome was already written. Hellcats from the USS Essex, USS Lexington, and USS Princeton tore through the formations like blades through paper. The old rules of air combat no longer applied. The Hellcat could dive, climb, and absorb punishment that would have destroyed a Zero instantly. Even when Japanese pilots attempted surprise attacks, radar-guided American fighters intercepted them long before they reached their targets. In just a few weeks of combat, U.S. Navy aviators claimed over 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. For every Hellcat lost, more than 13 Zeros fell. The myth of the superior Japanese pilot, once a haunting truth, had disintegrated under the weight of industrial precision and tactical evolution. In debriefings, American pilots repeated one phrase again and again. They fought bravely, but their planes were finished. And so, slowly, the legend of the Zero began to fade into the smoke of its own wreckage. When technology and training could no longer compete, Japan turned to desperation. In late 1944, the first kamikaze attacks began. Pilots flying aircraft loaded with explosives directly into U.S. ships. It was a grim evolution, the transformation of the warrior code into suicide doctrine. And yet even this final weapon met its match in the skies above the Pacific. Hellcats were often the first line of defense, intercepting kamikaze formations before they could dive on the fleet. Pilots spoke later of the horror of watching men deliberately aim their planes into death, and of the strange, terrible respect they felt for such determination. But the results were always the same. The Hellcats cut through them before they reached their targets, often destroying dozens in a single day. One pilot from VF-83 Squadron wrote in his combat log, "It wasn't combat anymore. It was prevention. They came straight at us, and we had to end it fast." The Americans fought not with hatred, but with grim precision. For every kamikaze that fell, they knew it was another young man who had been told his sacrifice would save an empire that no longer existed. The Zero, once the pride of Japan's skies, was now being used as a weapon of self-destruction. Its purpose had inverted completely. The fighter that had once symbolized supremacy now symbolized surrender. By 1945, the Hellcat had become the undisputed master of the Pacific. Its kill ratio stood at an almost unbelievable 19-1, the highest in aviation history for a frontline combat aircraft. Out of every 20 enemy aircraft engaged, 19 never returned home. The Zero, meanwhile, had become obsolete. Japan's factories could no longer build enough engines. Its pilots could no longer train fast enough, and its once feared fighter was outmatched in every measurable way. In the final months of the war, American air groups swept across the Pacific like a tide. Over Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and eventually Tokyo, they encountered resistance that was brave but hopeless. The last recorded Zero kill came in the spring of 1945. A brief, desperate clash over the Ryukyu Islands. The Japanese pilot dove headlong toward a carrier group, pursued by a Hellcat from the USS Essex. A few short bursts of gunfire ended the duel. The Zero exploded in a fireball and vanished into the sea. It was over. The aircraft that had once defined an empire had become a relic of a vanished age. From the cold mud of Akutan Island to the burning skies over the Philippines, the journey of the Zero was more than a story of machines. It was the story of how knowledge defeats myth, how observation, analysis, and adaptation can overcome even the most formidable enemy. The Americans had not won simply by building a better plane. They had won by understanding their enemy. Every screw, every weakness, every flutter of the Akutan Zero's wings had been studied and repurposed into a new kind of warfare. One built on logic instead of legend. The Hellcat's triumph was not only mechanical, it was philosophical. The Zero's downfall, meanwhile, was not a failure of courage, but of imagination. As 1945 approached its end, the skies above the Pacific were filled not with duels, but with silence. The age of the Zero, the myth of invincibility, was gone, and in its place stood a single truth carved in steel and fire. Understanding is the ultimate form of power. In August 1945, as mushroom clouds rose over Japan, the Pacific fell quiet for the first time in nearly 4 years. The war that had begun with a surprise attack from the air had ended with fire from the sky. When the guns fell silent, engineers and historians turned back to the origins of victory, to the tools, the tactics, and the knowledge that had changed everything. Among them stood a single relic that told the story of that transformation more clearly than any other, the Akutan Zero. After months of intense testing and countless flights, the captured Zero had been moved to the Naval Air Station at Patuxent River, Maryland. It had survived its purpose: to be understood, not revered. Its panels were worn from experiments. Its frame was patched from flight after flight. But it had done something extraordinary. It had given birth to the Hellcat, the Corsair, and an entire new generation of air warfare. In 1945, it was transferred to a Navy storage hangar, tagged simply, Captured Japanese Fighter, A6M It never flew again. A few years later, during a routine move between facilities, the Akutan Zero was accidentally damaged beyond repair. Its pieces were eventually scrapped. The machine that had changed the Pacific War was quietly dismantled. Its metal recycled, its memory fading into reports and photographs. But its influence remained everywhere. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, the man who had first flown the captured Zero, lived to see the end of the war. He returned to Grumman as a test pilot and continued flying through the early jet age. Whenever asked about the Akutan Zero, he spoke not with pride, but with respect. "It was a fine airplane," he once said, "but it was designed for a different war. We just learned faster." For Sanders, the Zero had been both enemy and teacher, the most valuable adversary he'd ever known. His quiet courage in flying that aircraft under such risk had saved lives on a scale even he could never fully comprehend. The engineers who studied the Zero, including Leroy Grumman and his design team, went on to shape post-war aviation. Their work on the Hellcat laid the foundation for carrier-based jet fighters that would dominate the skies in the 1950s and beyond. They proved that innovation was not only a matter of genius, it was a matter of curiosity. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, the Japanese pilot who crashed on Akutan Island, never knew the role he would play in history. In Japan, his name was barely remembered during the war. One of many missing aviators lost in remote corners of the Pacific. But after the war, when Allied historians uncovered the full story, his flight was recognized as one of the most consequential accidents in modern warfare. American officers who had recovered his aircraft later described how they had buried him respectfully, marking the grave with care. To them, he was not just the enemy. He was part of the story of victory. It was a quiet, human gesture in a war defined by destruction. By the late 1940s, the Zero's influence had stretched far beyond the Pacific. Its design principles, light frame, long range, high maneuverability, became case studies in engineering schools and aircraft factories worldwide. The lessons learned from its failures were even more valuable than its strengths. Every modern fighter that came after, the F6F Bearcat, the F-86 Sabre, and even early jet prototypes, carried within them the echoes of Akutan. The message was clear. Never underestimate your enemy, but never stop learning from them. The war had cost millions of lives. Yet from that cost came understanding, the kind that reshaped the world's balance of power, not through conquest, but through comprehension. The Akutan Zero never flew again, but its legacy soared higher than ever imagined. In every American carrier deck, in every classroom of aviation engineering, and in every story that asked not just who won, but how. When World War II ended, the propeller-driven era faded almost overnight. Within 5 years, jet engines were roaring down runways in America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, faster, higher, and deadlier than anything that had flown before. But even as technology leapt forward, the lessons of the Akutan Zero still guided design rooms and briefing tables. In the laboratories of North American aviation, engineers working on the F-86 Sabre studied the same flight data that had revealed the Zero's flaws. They knew speed was no longer the only answer. Stability, visibility, and energy retention mattered even more. In the Soviet Union, captured reports on the Zero's agility inspired parallel development of the MiG-15, proof that every nation, even former enemies, learned from the revelations that one crash had unlocked. At Grumman, the legacy continued. The Hellcat's engineers now turned their attention to jets like the F-9F Panther, combining durability and pilot survivability, the very qualities that had defeated the Zero. The world had changed, but the mindset that won the Pacific endured. Understand first, act second, evolve always. Japan's aircraft industry was dismantled after the war. For nearly a decade, it was forbidden to build military planes. But in post-war factories and classrooms, engineers still taught the story of the A6M Zero, not as a tale of triumph, but of warning. The lesson was humility. The Zero had been a masterpiece of design, light, agile, and elegant, but it was trapped by the same philosophy that created it. It had been built for short, glorious wars and pilots who would never return. It could not adapt to a long, grinding conflict against an industrial giant that learned faster than it produced. In Japan's reborn aviation industry of the 1950s, those lessons took root. The new generation of engineers focused not on sacrifice, but on sustainability. Aircraft that could endure, evolve, and protect. The very same factories that once built Zeros would one day produce commercial jets for Mitsubishi and Kawasaki, symbols not of conquest, but of recovery. What began as tragedy on Akutan Island ended as transformation, proof that even the ruins of war can teach peace. For the United States, the Akutan Zero became a case study in military intelligence. In declassified post-war manuals, it was cited as the perfect example of how a single recovered enemy weapon could change the trajectory of a global conflict. Generals and analysts recognized a simple truth. Victory doesn't belong only to those who fight hardest. It belongs to those who learn fastest. From then on, every American war effort included teams dedicated to technical recovery, from German rockets in Europe to MiG fighters in Korea. The principle of capture, test, and adapt became part of military doctrine worldwide. The Akutan Zero had started that tradition, not through planning, but through fortune, curiosity, and relentless analysis. Even today, military historians point to it as one of the most consequential captures in the history of warfare. A moment when information, not firepower, decided the outcome of battles yet to be fought. When the story of the Akutan Zero was finally made public decades later, it was remembered less as a tale of machines and more as a lesson in mindset. The Americans had not beaten Japan because of arrogance or overwhelming numbers. They had beaten them because they listened to data, to design, to the quiet lessons hidden in their enemy's craft. And in that, there was an unspoken moral. Pride builds legends. Knowledge builds victories. The Zero's death gave life to understanding, a truth that outlasted every wrecked carrier and every fallen pilot. In museums across the world, fragments of Zeros and Hellcats still stand side by side, one born from myth, the other born from learning. Together, they tell the story of a war decided not only by courage, but by curiosity, the kind that turns disaster into discovery, and enemies into teachers. The guns of the Pacific fell silent in 1945, but the lessons of Akutan never did. They still whisper through the hangars, in every aircraft that rises into the sky. A quiet reminder that understanding, more than strength, is what truly wins wars. It began with silence. A fog-bound island in the Aleutians, a crash no one saw, a pilot who never returned. From that stillness came revelation. The wreck of Tadayoshi Koga's Zero lay in the mud for weeks before anyone found it. Yet, from that single moment, from that accident, the entire balance of the Pacific War began to shift. Because one side had the humility to learn, and the other did not. When the Americans raised that aircraft from the earth and studied it, they didn't just uncover metal and mechanics. They uncovered the truth that even perfection can have weakness, and even the mighty can fall to those who question how. The lessons pulled from that captured plane rippled across the ocean. From a test hangar in California to the carrier decks at Midway, the Marianas, and Okinawa. Each flight of the F6F Hellcat carried more than bullets and fuel. It carried the knowledge of a single discovery. The idea that understanding, not imitation, defines mastery. The Zero had been born from myth, beauty without balance, speed without endurance. The Hellcat was born from reason, strength refined through study, victory built on observation. And when the war ended, the wreck of the Akutan Zero was gone, its pieces lost to time. but its echo remained. It lives in every aircraft designed with foresight, in every commander who listens before he strikes, in every engineer who believes that the enemy's best idea is worth learning from. The island is quiet again now. The fog still rolls in, and the wind still brushes over the grass where one machine fell and history rose. From that crash came a truth that outlived the war itself. Knowledge is the ultimate weapon.